The first time I noticed the snowman, I thought one of my neighbors had built it. It was December, and the first heavy snow of the winter had covered the entire neighborhood in white. I was standing at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee when I saw it near the sidewalk across from my driveway. It was a simple snowman made from 3 uneven balls of snow with black stones for eyes, a crooked carrot for a nose, and a faded red scarf around its neck. 2 dead branches served as arms. It looked completely ordinary, and I didn't think much about it. The next morning, however, I noticed something strange. The snowman had moved. The day before, it had been almost 20 feet from my driveway, but now it stood directly across from my front porch. I went outside and examined the snow around it. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, and no signs that anyone had dragged or carried it. Fresh snow covered the ground everywhere except beneath the snowman. I told myself that I must have remembered its original position incorrectly, but the following morning proved otherwise. The snowman had moved again. This time it was standing beside my mailbox. I took a photograph and called my neighbor Walter, an elderly man who lived 3 houses away. I asked if he had built it, but he immediately said no. When I sent him the photograph, his attitude changed. He told me not to touch the snowman because he had seen something similar years ago. Walter explained that before my house was built, an old wooden house had stood on the same property. A family named the Millers had lived there, and their 8-year-old daughter, Emily, had disappeared during a winter snowstorm. According to Walter, Emily had gone outside to play in the snow while her parents were inside. When they realized she was missing, they searched everywhere. Her footprints led away from the house toward the road, but suddenly stopped. Emily was never found. The old house was eventually abandoned, demolished, and replaced by the house I now lived in. Walter told me that Emily loved building snowmen. After her disappearance, strange snowmen began appearing around the property. At first, people assumed someone was building them as memorials, but sometimes the snowmen moved overnight without leaving a single footprint. That night, I decided to stay awake and watch the snowman myself. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and started recording through the front window. The snowman stood beside the mailbox, completely motionless. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock, then 2. Nothing happened. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, I heard a faint scraping sound outside. I looked through the window, but the snowman was still beside the mailbox. Then I heard the scraping again, this time much closer. I walked toward the front door and looked outside. The porch light flickered, and the snowman was suddenly standing at the bottom of my porch steps. I checked my phone recording, expecting to see myself somehow missing the moment it moved. The video showed the snowman beside the mailbox for hours, but at exactly 3:17 a.m., the image became distorted. When the picture returned, the snowman was already standing on my porch. There was no footage of it moving. Worse, for less than 1 second, a small figure appeared behind it. It looked like a little girl wearing a dark winter coat. I replayed the footage again and again, but the figure disappeared whenever I paused the video at that exact moment. The next morning, the snowman was gone. I opened the front door and found a trail of tiny footprints leading from the porch toward the woods behind the property. The footprints looked like those of a child. I followed them, telling myself that there had to be a logical explanation. About 50 yards into the woods, the footprints suddenly disappeared beside a small wooden box buried beneath the snow. Inside the box was an old photograph of a little girl standing beside a snowman. On the back of the photograph was a date from 22 years earlier and 4 words written beneath it: Emily's last Christmas. I dropped the photograph when I heard a child's voice behind me whisper, "That's mine." I turned around, but there was nobody there. I ran back to the house and immediately called Walter. He didn't answer. I tried several more times before he finally called me later that afternoon. He sounded frightened. He told me that after hearing my story, he had searched through old boxes in his attic. and found a newspaper clipping about Emily's disappearance. He also found an old photograph of her standing beside a snowman. When Walter sent me the photograph, I immediately recognized the snowman. It had the same crooked carrot nose, the same uneven arms, the same black stone eyes, and the same faded red scarf as the one outside my house. I asked Walter how that was possible. He didn't have an answer. Then he told me something he had never mentioned before. The morning after Emily disappeared, her parents found a snowman standing inside their living room. They had no idea how it got there. The next morning it was outside. After that, it appeared in different places around the property, always moving closer to the woods where Emily's footprints had vanished. Walter said Emily's parents eventually left town, and after the old house was demolished, the snowman stopped appearing. For years, nobody saw it again, until I moved into the new house. That evening, I looked through my window and saw the snowman standing at the end of my driveway. But this time, something had changed. The faded red scarf was gone. Around its neck was a small pink scarf that looked like something a child would wear. I watched in silence as the snowman slowly turned toward my house. I knew it couldn't have moved because snowmen don't turn, yet there was no doubt about what I had seen. A few seconds later, I noticed something written in the fresh snow beneath the snowman. The letters looked as if they had been drawn by a small finger. 3 words stared back at me. You found me. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the house. I never went back. A few months later, the property was sold to another family, and I tried to convince myself that everything had been some elaborate nightmare. Then, last winter, I received a photograph from an unknown number. The photograph showed my old house covered in snow. A new family lived there, and a little boy was standing outside beside a snowman. It looked exactly like the one I had seen. But behind the boy, in an upstairs window, stood a little girl. Her face was pale, her clothes appeared soaked, and one hand was pressed against the glass. Under the photograph was a message that said, "It moved again." I deleted the message and blocked the number. I told myself it was a cruel prank, but I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. Months passed, and eventually I stopped thinking about the house. Then one morning, I woke up to find that it had snowed outside my apartment. I looked through the window and froze. Standing across the street was a snowman. It had 3 uneven balls of snow, 2 black stones for eyes, a crooked carrot nose, and a faded red scarf. I stared at it for several minutes, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. Then the snowman slowly turned toward my window. I stepped away from the glass, but I couldn't look away. Look, that night I kept the curtains closed and stayed awake until sunrise. Nothing happened. When morning finally came, I forced myself to look outside. The snowman was still there, but now something was wrapped around its neck. It was a small pink scarf, exactly like the one I had seen at my old house. Beneath it, someone had written 3 words in the snow. "I missed you." I moved away from the window and called the police. But by the time they arrived, the snowman was gone. I never learned what happened to Emily Miller. Her body was never found, and nobody ever discovered where her footprints ended that night. But I know one thing now. The snowman was never a memorial. It wasn't something people built to remember her. It was something she left behind. Something that followed the place where she disappeared. And every winter, when the first snow falls, I keep my curtains closed. Because sometimes just before sunrise, I hear the faint sound of snow scraping against pavement outside my window. And I know that somewhere out there, the snowman has moved again.